Some of you I know have actually presented or come to our programs where we've been meeting with artists and looking at different works in the exhibition with various themes. So that's been very successful. So I want to start by a call out to Hope Pressman, who is no longer with us. But I think were it not for Hope, it may even be that this wouldn't happen. And although I had met George and Jeri a few years before any of this was really being proposed, I think it was a new occasion that Hope brought us together, and especially with Danielle, to think about how we could do something more here. So she is the gift that just keeps on giving. But also the George D. Green Art Institute, right? Has been phenomenal in this state and continues to be, and I know many of you are associated with it, but I really want to thank George and Jeri for really doing so much work on this, for being such fabulous artists too, and for working so well with Danielle, who we love and admire so much. So I'm really glad that you're going to be hearing from Danielle and her perspective on this exhibition too. As you may know, Danielle is our McCosh curator. The David and Ann Cookton McCosh collection are here, and she has not just expertise in American art, but she's passionate about the Pacific Northwest, David McCosh and others, and I think that comes through with the exhibition and in all that she does. So just thank you, Danielle. I want to thank so many of you artists who are here today for helping to make this show possible, and also for being committed to your practice. For really, you know, it takes a long time, and you've stuck with it, and the art upstairs is amazing. And I know that many of you are also teachers, so your legacy continues in what you've been able to share with other artists. And I think that's how we all keep going, and it's really important. And it's really important to acknowledge you and what you've done for Oregon and beyond. I also want to thank, again, George and Jeri, their board and advisors, especially Reagan Ramsey, Dan Biggs, and Barb Corden, who have made your programs possible and really helped with the guidance of that. I also want to thank the Ford Family Foundation, which has given us funds for the beautiful catalog that I hope many of you have. You can always buy more copies, but that's wonderful. And Danielle has an essay in that, but also Dr. Henry Sayre, who's Professor Emeritus at OSU Cascades. So we really want to thank Henry for participating in that project. Otherwise, our exhibitions, all of our programs, are really supported with endowment and private support. They're not funded by the university. So that takes a whole village and beyond to make those happen. And I especially want to thank the Coeda and Donald Barker Foundation, because their changing exhibitions endowments allow us to think big about the shows that we put on in the Barker Gallery. Also, the Oregon's Arts Commission, who gives us a bit every year to help, and we allocate it to projects that we think benefit our state. And of course, our exceptional JSMA members, and many of you are those, and we thank you for that. So Danielle will take it for here and explain what this evening is. But again, thank you for coming. Come often, support us, and support Danielle.
Thank you, Jill. See if I get that close enough. Does that sound okay? Ed, you're in the back. How's that? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So, yeah, thank you. I just want to echo all of the thanks that Jill shared. It's just been a delight working with the group of people involved in this exhibition and working with the audiences coming in for this show. That's just been what a wonderful pleasure. When you work so long on a project behind the scenes and you kind of, you know, reveal it to the world, you just don't always know what the audience reaction, the audience engagement might be. And I think it's just been really rewarding for those of us for whom this was just a little idea that, you know, the little idea that could years ago, to see so many people come in and be so excited about what's on view in the museum. And I hope that you'll return on Saturday, May 4th at 2 o'clock for the last of our artist tours in the gallery of that series, which will be on the theme of the human figure. So my talk tonight goes a little bit all over the place. I'll provide a curatorial perspective on how this exhibition came together, working with our partners And I'll mention some of the notable experiences or education activities of many of the artists who were in Oregon in the 1960s or 70s, might have been a part of or been influenced by. And this information, that portion of this will be really general because we have 45 artists represented in this show. And so none of these experiences that I might talk about as sort of examples here are going to be universally applicable to everyone. I just want to acknowledge that going in because otherwise we would be here for many hours. I hope that you'll instead come back to the show, read about artists you're interested in, reach out to them to learn about them or ask them questions about their practice, and kind of take the conversations on from here if that's something you're really interested in learning more about. In our gallery upstairs, we have what our colleague, our new associate curator of photography, Tom Sempre, had described as over 2,000 years of collective creative practice represented by these artists who have dedicated, in most cases, 50 years or more to perfecting and growing their craft in paint and in other materials. This show's focused primarily on painting, but if you're familiar with some of the other work that many of the artists in the show do, you'll know that they're really interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary artists in many cases. And we have the wall labels written by our wonderful curatorial extern, Caroline Phillips, and students who worked with her on that, and artist statements in the catalog that give more information about each painter's unique background. So it's been great fun to work with this group. This is about 75% of our exhibiting artists in one picture. So not everyone was here on that night to be in a group photo, but I'm just, some of you are here tonight, and that's so nice. And my apologies, because you're gonna hear a lot of things you already know from me if you're in the show. I titled this presentation, The Oregon Connection, because when members of the GDGAI, the George D. Green Art Institute, first approached the museum in 2014 or 2015, about their concept for an exhibition. That was a working title for the project. It's the title I used for my exhibition catalog essay. And ultimately, we adjusted that title for the show itself to say an Oregon Invitational. But the core of our exhibition theme was still grounded in looking at what was that community of artists, the connections between those who were in the show, and how did those connections stretch as their careers took them around the stage or further afield and working nationally and internationally. For some, and for others who's devoted all that time here in the state. So we thought that was a fitting way to start thinking about this presentation and how community is a vital theme for artistic growth. The initial concept grew out of conversations that George and Jeri and painters Susan Trueblood Stuart and Terry Melton, others had over cups of coffee talking about this time period of being, starting out in your career or having sort of formative experiences in Oregon in the 60s and 70s, whether that was coming here for graduate school, taking your first teaching job, or beginning to exhibit your work, or just making some change in your practice that really kind of set those artists on a path that has continued to enrich their practice now 50 years later. And this was a period of time when they came to me to talk about, when George and Jeri and members of the Institute came to me to talk about this idea, where they were setting up the nonprofit that would become the Institute. And by the time they reached out to the JSMA to pitch a concept for a group exhibition, they had already started working with many Oregon artists and many New York artists and others to connect original works of art, or as George says, handmade pictures without the aid of computers or maybe other technology. Certainly some of the artists in some of the earlier shows were working with photography or digital manipulation, but really that focus on the craftsmanship and the devotion to what the hands can make and sort of the magic inherent in that process. And so they had been sharing that with audiences in Oregon through smaller exhibitions at the Northwest Academy, a preparatory school in Portland, I think the Hillsborough Educational District. So these different groups to make sure that especially children who might not otherwise have regular access to original works of art or to go into an artist's studio, what an amazing experience when you're young to see that, would get those experiences. And a lot of my images, the image files are huge, so my slides are a little slow when I go through. So their proposal for collaborating on this show was exciting for a lot of reasons. Among them, the high percentage of artists on their recommended list who had connections to the University of Oregon, because the U of O had an MFA program in the 60s. A lot of artists who might have been studying elsewhere maybe came to do their graduate program here or take summer classes here. There's been a lot of focus on the alumni aspect, and a recent Register Guard article that said everybody in the show was a UO alum. That's not true. But working with the David McCosh materials here, and David McCosh being such an influential painter on the faculty here for so long, I was really interested too in getting to work so closely with people who had studied with him, because I spend a lot of my time here with materials in the collection by his hand, and now I'm spending more time talking to people who knew him through other ways, painting classes, even the lithography classes they might have taken with him. So that was really interesting to me in expanding my role here too. And so even though that's not a central part of the exhibition, it was kind of in the back of my mind with this. And here's Terry Melton, one of the artists in the show, got his MFA at the U of O in 1964, and here's a portrait he did of David McCosh then. And just to McCosh by the late photographer Mary Randlett, who passed away this year, taken shortly after he retired. So as I mentioned, many of the artists invited to participate in the JSMA's iteration of the show had been supporting the Institute's educational initiatives with loans of their artwork and access to their studio over the past several years. And so that was our starting point for thinking about the variety of works we hope to include in the JSMA's exhibition. And certainly there's a very long list of artists whose careers and talents align with the Invitational's concept. And so given more space, if I had the whole museum, I could have filled it with artists who sort of meet our pretty general criteria we kind of put together of artists who were in Oregon at this time. I wanted to focus on painting because I thought that those parameters for this show would make sense for kind of what we wanted to achieve here at the JSMA, for kind of looking at a specific component of artist practice. In some cases, there are artists outside of our checklist who maybe I've worked with recently or plan to work with in the future. So we wanted to start with who are the artists who have been working with the Institute, and how do we kind of grow that list with me being a curator, being involved, and adding an additional voice to those conversations. And I'll just go back for a moment, because those are some of the images from the earlier Institute shows or events where they're especially connecting children with the work, and they do workshops. And if you want more information about the Institute, I know who can tell you a lot more about all the great projects they're doing. So Jill and I had a lot of back and forth with George and Jeri and others for months before we really honed in on what we wanted to do for the exhibition. And as we were fine-tuning an invitation list, we even toyed with the idea of including, maybe looking for early works from this period by each of our invited artists and recent work to kind of show, you know, that step, that leap they might have made. But also, if you were looking at a work from the 60s and something made last year, you can look for connections between the two. And we kind of started to turn against that idea early on in talking about logistics, because I wanted to be able to include more artists, and knowing that we would have, if we were trying to do that initial concept, would have cut down our list considerably. And so with offering a museum curator perspective on exhibition planning, I know that, as I mentioned in earlier shows, the Institute had done include prints and photographs and other materials, and I think that might be directions that they'll be looking at for future shows too. So we came together with our list of artists we wanted to invite, and I wrote to them. Everyone responded, so 45 people submitted images. We had asked people to submit maybe up to 4, and then we would build a checklist from that list. And so I think we looked through, you know, maybe almost 180 images when all was said and done, and reached out to people and started working on the loans for this. And when we and curators used terms like regional art, I recognize that, you know, if we say Pacific Northwest art, Oregon art, those are really helpful and meaningful terms in a lot of ways for allowing us to discuss and document art that has some relationship with a certain region, responding to or influenced by, either overtly or more subtly or indirectly, the shared experience of that place. But we also know, you know, that can sometimes operate as a box to kind of limit the way we're thinking about the art. And there's really no unifying theme to regional artists' work. Some explore the environment that they work in or their memories of those places, and some focus on the social fabric of the location or respond to the work of their contemporaries. Others might seem to ignore the physical surroundings entirely. And so we know, you know, we thought, well, who qualifies as an Oregonian for this show? It's an Oregon Invitational. What do we mean by that? You know, Karen Carson, whose tractor painting is one of the largest works in the show, visible here in the installation photo. And she was born and raised in the Willamette Valley, but left Oregon after her undergraduate studies and never returned to live here. But we were interested in looking at what work she's doing now. Richard Thompson, third-generation Oregonian, and although he was out of the state for 30 years of his professional career, he returned to his family's land in Dayton in 2011. Hugh Webb spends half his time in McMinnville and the other half in Palm Springs, California. So most of the artists in our show that we invited live in Oregon full-time right now, but have a very diverse experiences as Oregonians, no matter how long that residency may have been. We thought that was all valid for the show's concept. And when collector Virginia Hazeltine, whose history with this museum is particularly important since she helped steer the museum into collecting Northwest art in the 60s, sort of setting things in motion to get to where we are today with our collection and with our initiatives in Pacific Northwest art. When she was writing about her collection in the 60s, and she kind of provided her own definition of Northwest, the way that she considers it in her own collection, she said, "We include not only the Oregon-born artists and craftsmen, but those who have studied or worked professionally in their area for a few years." So we felt like we were in good company kind of following with that description. And shortly before Visual Magic opened in January, someone in the arts community asked me whether the gallery would feel like an Oregon show, if a visitor will know that they're looking at Oregonian painters. And I could tell he wasn't asking that with an expectation of a correct answer. I mean, it was a valid question. My reply was, well, if you read the labels, you'll know, but I think the diversity of work in the show, if you're not already familiar with some of these artists coming in, I think there's nothing about the show that's going to scream Oregon in a way that might be limiting. I mean, it's really exciting to think all of this came from artists who maybe should kind of have this shared foundation. It's a wonderful way to be thinking about what would make something feel like an Oregon show to us. What are those things? And it's certainly not just as a great point that George has made in talking about the concept for the show and others. It's certainly not just a story of Portland's art. Portland being the size of the city it is and the arts community it has certainly makes sense that it's been a hub in the way we talk about the history of Oregon painting, but we know that artists were moving in and out, and some weren't in Portland at all, and there were galleries outside of Portland, arts organizations and advocates outside of Portland. So we really wanted to look at this group of artists for the way that they interacted with one another statewide as much as we could. And thinking about that would best serve the exhibition, and even how, if they started in certain academic classes together, what were they doing when they were looking over one another's shoulders and comparing their work or being competitive in the classes? Some of the stories I've heard from some of our artists describe. And having just had the honor of working with Mark Clark and Margaret Coe on a show a few years ago, and thinking about photographs I'd seen of Mark in the studio here at the U of O, provided by family members. Just going quickly through these since I have a lot of slides. These are just some of the things I've been thinking about kind of going into this concept. But I also revisited this really wonderful catalog for George Johansson's show Equivalents that was at the Portland Art Museum in 2002. And he made 80 portraits of some artist friends from primarily in Portland, which included several of the artists that we had on our list for our exhibition. So I wanted to go back and look at those images. So here's some familiar faces from the show. He drew the portraits in 1999, and then they were exhibited a few years later. And there's this wonderful quote that he put in his artist statement for the book, where he says, he's sort of acknowledging the role that having working artists among us, what it does for a community, whether you're an artist or not, especially since so much of art making is done privately. Well, what is the sort of public benefit? All this is feeding into a better community, better environment for all of us, but especially for other artists who are among one another's work, and we're all enriched from that experience. When I was thinking about the portraits by George Johansson, we have portraits by a UO graduate, Robert Miller, a photographer who then went to teach at Lewis and Clark College, by several of the artists in the show as well. So I was going back to look at portraits of some of these artists to see, well, what did their studio look like at the time? What work were they photographed just a few years after they maybe started on their career? So here's Robert Miller's photo of George Green. I didn't tell any of the artists who would or wouldn't be included in images here, and some of George's early works, because I was also thinking, well, what do we have in our collection here? What is this museum that's been collecting Northwest art since the 60s? Who among this group might already be represented in our collection? And looking at series of work that George did that ended up here and is the part of the State Capitol collection. And here's George giving a studio tour to our exhibition interpreters, our docent program at the Art Institute in January to kick off the show. But I'll back up just a little bit here because I wanted to go back to talking about George Johansson just a little bit more. He's our most senior artist in the exhibition, and his mentors at the Museum Art School had encouraged him to study in New York. So he had started at the Museum Art School in the 1940s and then spent the early 50s in New York and then spent some time in Mexico. and then returned. And at that time, a lot of his earlier paintings were sort of abstract expressionist with suggestions of figures or landscapes. But he then had a sabbatical in London in 1965 to 1966, where he looked at Francis Bacon's work and he looked at David Hockney's work, and sort of the radical renderings of the human form in those artists' work. So this is an example of an artist in the show for whom the 1960s, for him, leaving Oregon was an important component of his growth. To go away, study, expand what he was looking at, whose work he was thinking about, apply that to his practice, and bring that back to Oregon. And in the 60s and 70s, there was a really strong international component of influences in the state of artists who were doing this kind of study, leaving and coming back to share, or maybe who had trained elsewhere and were coming to Oregon for more permanent, long-term teaching jobs. So here's the exhibition poster from after his return from London, and he returned to teaching at the Museum Art School, and was in fact the instructor for a lot of the painters who are in this show. The Museum Art School had received accreditation to offer a Bachelor of Fine Arts in the early 60s, and so they started having degree programs, and by the end of that decade, a lot of artists had come through with a formal degree. And by 1970, at the Museum Art School, the thesis students who did their work on the fourth floor, the top of the museum, because the school was still housed in the Portland Art Museum at that time, it would later become the Pacific Northwest College of Art and move to a new building and separate from the museum. At that time, here just to show you the painting by George Johansson in this exhibition and an earlier print in the museum's collection of Louis Bunce, his mentor and teacher at the Museum Art School. So thinking about how this knowledge is passed, not just from place to place, but generation to generation between teacher and student, and often those relationships would be blurred and become mentors or friendships that would carry on long after the students had been in school with someone. So here's C.S. Price Huckleberry Pickers, and because students going to that school at the time, they would go into the museum, they would get to walk by the work of Northwest masters going into their classes, and C.S. Price Huckleberry Pickers was in the Portland Art Museum until the Timberline Lodge opened its C.S. Price wing in 1975, so students were seeing this work regularly, and former student and retired Portland Art Museum curator Bonnie Ling Malcolmson compared C.S. Price's work, which she deemed hip with a Western edge, that's her quote, to Picasso and Braque's innovations at that same time. So this is something some of the artists, in talking in their gallery tours or in interviews with me before the show opened, talking about who their contemporaries were, whose work you were looking at this period. Well, this is pre-postmodernism. Picasso is still alive. You're looking at the work of, and we're speaking sort of from a Western sense of artists in Europe or New York, but these are a lot of the people who we might now talk about as sort of figures from the past, but were alive and well and creating amazing work and having experimental periods at this time. So they were the contemporaries of artists who are in the show. And I think a few people have mentioned that in talking about the way they influenced their own work and sort of the challenge they looked at in their work. And also happening around this time, Arlene Schnitzer started the Fountain Gallery in Portland, at which many of the visual magic artists' works were shown or sold while it was open as the Fountain Gallery between 1961 and 1986. And some of the artists had talked about, going to her gallery, the Image Gallery, other galleries that were opening around the state or arts organizations where they could see original works of art by artists whom they admired and maybe connect with them. And what a profound way that increased their own arts education outside of the studio or outside of the classroom. And just so other things happening in the state that I don't have images for, so we'll leave Arlene Schnitzer up to look at. The Eugene Art Center had been founded in 1950 by a group of local artists, including Maud Kearns, who was teaching here and working with the collection here at what was the University of Oregon Art Museum at that time, and later became the Maud Kearns Art Center, nonprofit community center. In the 1960s, as I mentioned, this museum began to collect outside of its original founding collection of Asian art and have significant growth in adding work to the collection from other cultures and other time periods. Dennis Gould, one of the artists in the show and a UO graduate, began work as the statewide services coordinator for the museum's new traveling exhibitions program. So they were circulating art shows free of charge to regional venues. So a lot of movement of contemporary art around the state. 1964, the painter Betty LeDuc came to Southern Oregon University to teach, and at that time she was, I think, only the second woman art teacher there, and for 18 years she was the only woman in their art department, and she was starting classes like looking at art in the third world, women in art, these topics of classes that were not being taught anywhere else that she was introducing in the way that her students were thinking and talking about the visual arts and sort of their role in the larger community aspect of art making. In 1966, when Oregon Governor Mark Hatfield had public hearings throughout the state on the topic of a new Arts and Humanities Commission, there were artists who were attending those and advocating for what they thought that commission should look like in terms of membership and what they thought it was important that it resolved to do. Painter Harry Woodman and others attended and urged that the membership on a commission must include professional artists working in major fields because they thought no one else could speak on their behalf. You need working artists to do so. That stipulation didn't even make it into the membership requirements for the what became the Oregon Arts Commission, but they regularly still included practicing artists in their membership. But Evelyn George founded the Whitebird Gallery in Cannon Beach in 1971, and so she ran it for nearly 40 years until she passed away, and that was one of the first galleries to combine arts and crafts in the state, and that was on the Oregon coast. So a lot was happening outside of Portland, but certainly all of this kind of feeding into the larger statewide support for art and challenges within the arts. Outside of painting, the Oregon International Sculpture Symposium was organized by UO professor Jan Zak and held here in Eugene in the summer of 1974. The founding of the Oregon Center for the Photographic Arts by 5 young photographers in 1975 in Portland became the Blue Sky Gallery. And also in 1975, Oregon instituted its Percent for Art legislation, first in Marion and Polk counties, because it was tied to construction projects happening there. But this was a mandate that 1% of the direct construction costs for a new or remodeled state building, if they were spending state funds and their budget was over $100,000, 1% of that budget had to be devoted to art for that building. So that continues. Thankfully, that continues. You think of the impact that legislation has made here at the University of Oregon campus, too, with new buildings. That means fairly significant art budgets come along with any of the construction projects and ensure that art is being purchased or commissioned to become part of a statewide public art collection. The Blackfish Gallery was founded as a cooperative art gallery in Portland in 1979, and so on and so on. And many of the artists in this show were really vital to that advocacy and this happening in Oregon. Painter Nancy Lindbergh, whose earlier work is shown here, and a great quote from her that speaks to the value of arts organizations and city arts associations, was the executive director of the Salem Art Association throughout the 70s, and then she became the artist services coordinator for the Oregon Arts Commission. That she was there until 1991. So increasingly new opportunities for artists to be paid for their work and have jobs where their work would stay in the state and be highly visible. And they've actually just made the public art collection for the state searchable online, so you can go online and see where works purchased through Percent for Art. To a degree, this existed before, but they just in March launched a really fine database for looking at that work. There's Nancy talking about her work that's in the show a couple of weeks ago. So our catalog essayist, Henry Sayre, discussed many of the national and global events that artists were actively responding to, either in their art or in their personal or professional lives, either directly or it was affecting them in different ways. The common reading assigned book for the University of Oregon this year is a memoir about the Vietnamese War and a Vietnamese family and their experience. It's called The Best We Could Do, written by T. Bowie, who was here to speak on campus last term. We had a common seeing exhibition in response to that book on view until just a few weeks ago. And it was really wonderful that worked out, that we had works on view that responded to that time period or were of that time period at the time when we have works on view by artists who were sort of coming of age while this was going on, and it's certainly a topic of national concern. And although that show is closed, we've now opened photographs from the Cuban Revolution, which predates that a little bit, in another gallery. So still some sort of contemporaneous discussions about art happening beyond the United States in other galleries. And sometimes things just line up that way here, even if we don't purposefully plan them to do so. Thinking about artist activism, here's some images from the Scab Sheet that was an Oregon State University dissident newspaper, kind of published in response to feeling like the official newspaper of the university was maybe not giving people the full story. And so one of our artists in the show, Laura Ross Paul, as a college student, was the political cartoonist, I think anonymously at the time for this newspaper, knowing that she was kind of sticking her neck out to write for this paper at a time when she had scholarships and certainly wanted to stay on the good side of her school, but wanted to make an impact in terms of expressing discomfort with the Vietnam War and other topics, other things happening in the state and more nationally and globally. And here's some other works by Laura Ross Paul, a work from the late 1970s, and one of the two works in the show by that artist. And I love this quote that Laura had said. She was, her thesis instructor, when she was in her MFA program, had passed away, and she was hired to take over those teaching jobs. So the first woman hired, I guess at PSU, and to teach those classes, and it launched her into a teaching career, teaching at several other universities too. But looking back at that time in her life, she said, when you're in art school, you realize you're forming the audience that you will work for the rest of your life. So those things that you're doing, who you're paying attention to, who's paying attention to you at that period, that community just grows and expands with time. The youngest artist in the show, James Lavador, I didn't go back and check my math on that, but grew up in Pendleton, and although he did not go to one of the formal programs for his arts education, he had the great benefit, the luck of living where wonderful ceramic sculptor Betty Fivas lived, and studying from her. She took him on as her protege in some ways in terms of teaching him about attitudes towards art making and kind of the realities of the art world, because she was someone living kind of removed from big cities and the gallery market, and really focused on her craft. And it really made an impression on him as a young man learning to paint and first starting to exhibit his paintings, first in Seattle and then in Oregon, even though he was living in Oregon towards the end of the 1970s and the 1980s. And he was just quoted in this wonderful New York Times article about the Crow's Shadow Institute of the Arts that he founded 25 years ago, where he said, Crow's Shadow, and this is a place where artists can come and work in residency as printmakers. It's focused on providing opportunities, sort of twofold, for Native artists to have a place where they can share and practice their craft and teach others, but also to be a conduit for contemporary Native art to go beyond Oregon, too. So printmaking by Native artists, but also non-Native artists who come and print there and get to work with Native artists and kind of learn from the educational environment that Crow's Shadow Institute provides. And so he's one of several artists in the show who are also incredible printmakers, for whom we wanted to include painting by for this show. But I just love him laying out, here are the things that artists need, and how has this changed since the time when their careers were starting? Well, it really hasn't. So a little bit about our process. I was able to visit a lot of our artists and do studio visits or have conversations with them to get a little deeper into learning about their work. Some of the artists in the show, many of the artists in the show, if I'd met them before or worked with them on past projects, or George and Jeri had personal connections to artists, we kind of spread out our study of the artist. So I couldn't personally make it to everyone's studio, but got to spend a lot of time with a lot of artists. And especially since the show is open, got to spend more time with artists. Here's me and my colleague Cheryl visiting Richard Thompson. I had a wonderful studio visit with Betts Cole in Elmira because she had submitted work for the show that were larger paintings, and then she and I had gotten to talking about some of her larger paintings, and she was excited about something she was doing more recently. She's still painting at a larger scale as well, but she's been making these little, what she calls her little vignettes, of scenes from her travels, either color or black and white. And going into her studio, she had all these clipped up around the ceiling. It was a really impressive way to walk into her studio and sort of see what she had captured from recent travels to Cuba and California and Colorado and Mexico and throughout the state. And so just from that conversation with her, we decided, this is a picture I took in her studio that day, as we were laying them out on a piece of board on the floor. We said, well, what if we, instead of doing a larger painting in the show, showed off some of these vignettes that you've been making and do it in a group that speaks to how travel has influenced you and influenced your worldview. And she liked that idea, and we ended up, those were the ones we kind of chose together, and we ended up putting them on the wall in that same layout for this show. through this process, when I had first started talking to our artists about their work, Ed Koch passed away, and he and I had already been emailing, or I'd been emailing with family members about his work, so we had submissions from him of paintings for this show, and he passed away before I was able to kind of confirm with him what direction we wanted to go with our selections. So it's unfortunate to me that I didn't get the opportunity to meet him, but I got to meet his family when they came for the show and worked closely with them. That painting, that still life painting, is on a black background, so it just disappears into the PowerPoint slide, but it's a square canvas if you've seen the work upstairs. And some great photos from the 1960s that Abigail Calkin provided of Ed from a page in their scrapbook. And then Jan Reeves, who was a longtime professor here at the University of Oregon, passed away unexpectedly this summer. Unexpectedly to me this summer, because she'd been emailing with me for just a couple weeks before her passing, too, about the show. And I had the pleasure of working with her and knowing her, both being on the UO campus and a faculty show that we did here a few years ago. So that was, personally a really significant loss, too, that I was pleased that her family and her gallery also supported us, including her in this show. This is a great picture of her speaking in her gallery at the show in 2016, from which the work we included in our show, Lapse Pruning, comes. So if you've been up in the gallery, you've noticed that not everything in the show is two-dimensional. So we were also thinking about artists who are using paint, thinking about our definition of painting. Well, we thought, well, paint-based projects are eligible for this. So paint has to be involved in some way, but we're not requiring it to be in a certain frame. And Connie Kiener's been perfecting her craft of making painted ceramics in this Italian tradition since first making independent trips to Italy in the late 1970s and going back over a 20-year period regularly to participate in workshops and really perfect what she does with this painting and firing technique. So 2 of her works are included in the show. This is where I start to get into slides where the image sizes are bigger, so there's even more of a delay. But on the right, you'll see an image of what's called a sister dress by a now California-based artist, Margaret Matson. And she was another artist who initially had submitted some images, and in conversations with her and talking to her about what she's really excited about, I got to learn more about these paper sculpted dresses that she has been making, where she crafts even the armature that they're on, where she's using stamped papers and painted papers and crafting this garment out of paper and all these other materials. And she had talked about the way that informs her thinking about painting and compositions for painting, and so we thought that was an interesting work to include in this show. If you are from Eugene or have gone to the Holt Center up until this past 2017, you might know Margaret's work because she was one of the 2 artists who was commissioned to create the Blackberry curtain that hung on the stage at the Holt Center for 35 years before it was retired 2 years ago. So just further underscoring artists who work in painters who are working in multiple media and are equally as much a fabric or textile artist or a printmaker, like Kacey Joyce's work shown here. And one of the other things that was interesting to me about working with this group of artists and thinking about their careers and their livelihoods is that although I think it goes to say everyone has been actively making work for this whole period with very few gaps in their practice. Many have found teaching jobs or were supporting themselves on their art for longer periods of time. But so many other artists were also turning their creative inclinations into careers, like Robert Gamblin, who's here tonight, so he might be available for questions later. Here's an earlier painting from 1970s and an installation view of the 4 works that are in view upstairs, who's made a career also out of perfecting this manufacture of paint. So if you're familiar with Gamblin conservation colors and the factory studio in Portland, hand in hand with his development of his own painting practice and his development as an artist has been this obsession and development of, well, what goes into the materials and what goes into the colors that artists do, because you have to understand your materials intimately to be able to use them to their best ability. Clint Brown, longtime instructor at the Oregon State University, but also developed one of the most important textbooks on drawing the human figure. So artists who are expanding what they're doing in their teaching in all sorts of directions, and these are just a few examples of how all the artists in the show have been doing this. Phyllis Yes, here's an earlier painting from our museum's collection, but she's also a playwright. And if you had the opportunity to see Lucinda Parker's retrospective at the Halliford that just closed last weekend, just a tremendous show they put on there. It was so wonderful to get to look at her development as a painter at a time when we were thinking about that for this show. So I had to just include some examples of her work. The painting Sweet Tooth that was in that exhibition, this great portrait by Mary Ranlett from 1972. So one of the things I was also thinking about with this show is, as the submissions came in and we were working on the checklist, is how many of these paintings were responsive to the land and the variations that artists took on thinking about the concept of landscape or the environment. Very few paintings are maybe there's much more depth to them than you might look at a work and say, oh, I might recognize that place, or that looks like somewhere I've been in Oregon. And in all cases, as you peel back the layers of what was the artist thinking about or what were they trying to achieve with that painting, you learn sort of more and more about what fed into their interest in depicting natural elements or landscapes, sometimes in Oregon or inspired by Oregon, sometimes beyond. And I'm sorry to be going through these so fast, but they're all upstairs. So I'd really encourage you to look at them in person, too, if you have the time. And I love that this painting by Gary Meacham really, really speaks in a very subtle way to the theme of community among these artists, because the figure, you see a little figure in red there. There. So that's Jim Shull, who's another one of the artists in the show, and Gary painted this on a trip he made with Jim Shull and I think Leland John and some other artists who were not in our exhibition. So for some of these artists, they might not have seen one another for 40 years. Maybe they came to the opening reception and got to reconnect. But for many of the artists, they've been friends or following one another's work through this whole time. And that was really lovely to see in the conversations and the mingling that's been happening when we've been spending time in the gallery together. So I'll quickly go through a little overview of some of the ways that we've been connecting with different audiences while the show's been on view here, and then we'll have time for some discussion, some conversation at the end. We have a program with our arts and healthcare focus here at the museum. That's one way that we work with the Department of Education here at the U of O, and arts and healthcare, focusing on, well, what can art making, art viewing, talking about art, visual thinking strategies provide for people. So some of my colleagues that run a program called Reflections and Connections, is focused on individuals who might be have early onset or mild dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or maybe other memory issues, who come and spend time in the museum for focused conversations and guided looking exercises about works in the museum, and then do an activity in the studio after. So here's one that a participant made in response to looking at George's paintings. Here's an example of my colleague, Hannah Bastian, our museum educator, leading a discussion of Jon Jay Cruson's painting. And looking at Erik Sandgren's painting. And participants attend with a caregiver or a family member, so that person gets to participate in the art activity in the studio afterwards. So here's a mother and daughter pair, Audrey and Pam, who were in the group looking at Erik Sandgren's painting, and then made work in response. So there's one painting that's not installed in the gallery yet, but will be here next week, and we'll get to enjoy that 45th artist's work for the last month of the show being on view. And that's a brand new painting by Isaka Shamsud-Din, and here's an example of his earlier work. Here's one in the Portland Art Museum collection, 1967, that depicts his two brothers and his good friend, and it's named Hare, Lion, and Spider after West African sort of stories about folk tales about animals and the attributes you might think of with particular animals. So it's calling, one brother the hare, the trickster, and the lion is the strong one, the spider is the clever friend. So Isaka was working on new paintings, big new paintings that he was really excited about at the time when I had first reached out to him with this invitation to participate in our show. And he had invited us to visit his studio and see what he had in the works. And we were really all drawn here's a small detail from the painting he was working on it at the time of Carolyn Phillips and I visited him late in the summer. So you can see that he has the historical photograph that also appears on the cover of Richard Wormser's book, The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow, of these young boys who are sort of forced into outdoor labor, sort of a continuation of the conditions of slavery, essentially. If they were orphaned or who were wards of the state, they could be forced into labor like this. So he was taking this historical photo. He taped it up on his canvas to show us how he was depicting 6 of the young boys from that picture in his own painting that's expanding to also be a work that honors the legacy of Buffalo soldiers. And so there was the 10th Cavalry, I think, was the first of the Buffalo soldiers, but there was also a regiment at Fort Vancouver, the Vancouver Barracks, in 1899. So he's looking at the history of African American soldiers in the Northwest and depicting one fellow from that story. You'll see, so these are just details of the painting, but the painting will be installed next week, so you can come back and see. And here's some more historical photographs showing the style of clothing and the style of dress, the style of hat that he was looking at in making these works. This Saturday is Slow Art Day, which is a national, for people who recognize my daughter smiling at this picture, she's the one in the blue hat, almost disappears into all the bright, wonderful colors of that painting. So if we're not doing any formal programming in the museum on Saturday, but Slow Art Day encourages you to go to a museum and spend a considerable amount of time looking closely at a painting. So we think there's some really great options to come here and choose a painting to spend some time with in this gallery or elsewhere in the museum. And there's a lot of information about Slow Art Day online if that strikes your fancy. We'll also have a family day at the JSMA, which engages with all of the exhibitions in the museum, but certainly we'll have a lot of activity in the Barker Gallery with this show. I have 2 students that are working on sort of a gallery activity guide to encourage families to look closely at paintings there. And then you can come back in May to attend our last gallery talk, The Human Figure, where we'll have Laura Ross Paul and Connie Kiener and George Johansson and Jeri Hise talking about their works on view. So I wanted to take this last little bit of time, or as much time as we want to spend. Let me cheat and see what time it is. For a little bit of Q&A discussion with George and Jeri. And if any of our other artists who are here would like to sit with us at that table, we'll bring up the lights, and we have microphones and we have water. And we can take questions, or I might have questions for you. If I've said anything wrong in this presentation, now's your time to correct me publicly, which is fine. So I'd love if you could come up and do that, and we'll just spend some time hopefully talking to you about questions you might have about the artist's experience. So, thank you. Do you want to just really quickly into the microphone introduce yourself?
I'm George Green.
I'm Jeri Hise.
And I'm Robert Gamblin.
So I think we're all open to questions or observations or reflections.
I think that this show is one of the most joyful experiences to walk into. I've been to lots and lots and lots of museum shows, and there is something so different about this. And it's not just because I'm in it, but, which is enough to make me really happy. But it is just a gorgeous show, and you kind of walk in and feel a jolt of energy. And I'd like to know how you got here from wherever. How did you think this up? How did you put it together? I mean, I heard a little bit about your parameters, but can you give us a little?
Do you want me to have a shot at that?
Please.
Well, first off, the joyful kind of a thing, that's an intuitive response looking around, because that's my nature to some extent. It's Jeri's nature. We didn't think about that, but here's an observation that I have. Postmodern work, I'm talking from a New York perspective, art magazines, all that business. When we go back to to the early 60s and come present, you could say something that will sound cynical, but it's also true. If it's really profound, it will be ugly. Sorry to tell you that, folks. Sometimes, and it'll be gloomy, if it does anything at all. Now, I'm going to say that because there's a lot of this work that I love that's not joyful, and it's gloomy, and it's dark, and this and that, powerful work. There's also an awful lot of it that's been elevated on the basis that no one in hell likes it. So it must be good. Telling you a true thing. So anyway, so when we're looking around at work, the thing that was most important to me, aside from it came out of this Cie, this time and so forth, was the fact that the work was authentic. It wasn't work that was made so it looked like art. And again, I'm talking from a New York perspective here because so many people lead with an aspiration for a career. As a consequence, tend to make pictures that look like art. Now, if you're doing that, as Chuck Close says, if your art looks like art, it's probably someone else's art. How, if you're doing something original, how in the world would you ever know if it's any good or not? You never saw anything like that. That's kind of the deal that we're looking around. And as a consequence of that, we tend to find things that are sort of joyful. I mean, most of us in here, we don't go around threatening to cut our own throats. We're doing the best we can. So that would be my explanation of why the joyfulness comes through as an overall sense of the show. I could talk forever on this, but I'm not going to.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how the idea came up with, because I was told it was over a cup of coffee, you and Terry and others, and what did that really look like?
It really looked exactly like that. And I mean, here's old friends having a cup of coffee and a little bit of reminiscing, because we were all at school at that time, and we're thinking, there's a lot of good work that's gone on. Are you hearing me still? Am I yelling? Boy, last time I talked, anyhow, a lot of good work that was unknown in Oregon or unknown outside of Eugene or outside of Corvallis. Little pockets of authentic artists doing good stuff, in some cases great stuff. Also artists who were schooled here, who went off to other parts of the country. All of this was unknown to the state because, and here's a bias I have, and I think it will prove out, Portland produces some really, really good artists. But for the most part, it's a bubble. It keeps referencing itself, and mistakenly, it's thought to be Oregon art. It's Portland art. Oregon art is a lot broader, as this exhibition will show you. And we got to thinking about this and talking about it, and pretty soon we got some pretty fierce opinions going. As a consequence of that, we thought, well, we had more conversations about this, of course, but we thought, well, where this show should be at the University of Oregon. Many of us were at the University of Oregon, and so on. And so we took a chance that the people who are in charge, and a couple other ones, Hope Pressman being an important bridge as I'm seeing it, would pay attention to this. And sure enough, they did. Does that work? Or should I keep pumping on this one?
I guess I'd like to interrupt a little bit. Or, can you hear me? Can't tell if it's on or not. As far as us sitting around having coffee, I think one of the things that really happened for us is that we just became filled with memories of friends and people we had not seen for so many years who we were in college with and who were painting and doing printmaking and all of that. And so we conjured up these people in our minds that we were curious about, many we hadn't seen in years and years and years. I think that's how it really kind of started, is that it was this kind of magical conjuring of memories and reminiscences of people. And then we kind of got more and more excited about, well, gosh, maybe we could, be fun to see what so-and-so is doing and someone else, and well, do you remember so-and-so? And so I think it kind of came from all of that. And for me, my first impression when I walked into the show, and I think I said it before, was that I was just dumbfounded, and it just seemed like it was a cosmic convergence.
I just want to make a comment off of your observation about the joyfulness of the show. And I think one thing that really contributes to that is that there is an absence of political and social commentary. And we live in such political times right now, and a lot of the art that's being made is certainly reflective of that and participates in that discussion. And it's just very nice to have a break, to go in that room. It's not political, no social commentary. It's just sort of about, the beauty of the process of making paintings.
This question is primarily for Robert, but also for George and Jeri. Can you talk more about how working with paint has changed your process? I thought that was so interesting what Danielle was saying.
Yes, I'd be happy to address that. I've felt for a number of decades. So first of all, I went to art school here at the University of Oregon, and then I had a studio as I did series of many jobs. And I was never able to sort of give myself to any of the opportunities that came my way because they weren't close enough to painting. And so finally it dawned on me, why don't I do something just right as close to painting as possible? And so by the making of paint all these 4 decades now, I found out, like, wait, I'm not close to painting, I'm actually inside painting. And so, the making of paint and the studio, for me, sort of became this one big feedback loop. When I was at the 3-row mill and these waves of color would be coming at me all day long, I'd be noticing, oh, that's what the mass tone looks like. Oh, that's what the transparency looks like. And gee, I wonder, and then and over time, what sort of took its place from a lot of technical kinds of approach to color is just the power of the emotional content of color. And that's sort of what sort of entered into my process in the studio is these are all my friends. I've got like 96 friends that I know as well as anyone in my family. And so I'm going to decide which one of these characters are going to, come out onto the stage, which is my palette, and then get brought to use. And how I would sort of think of them is purely for their emotional contents. And so that, from making paint, has sort of totally infected my painting process, where I'm a landscape painter, but I use landscape merely as an excuse to explore these color relationships, all sort of based on emotion. I mean, that's what I strive to do, and in a good one, I think I get sort of close there, but it's sort of a daily struggle.
I think Robert is also speaking about just the basic magic of alchemy. And at one point in my life, I was much more of a printmaker, and with printmaking, it's all about alchemy, acids, and just all kinds of processes, and then the simple act of just painting and painting with oils is the lovely feeling of pushing grease around. There's just nothing like it, and as often as I use acrylic, I always come back to oil. I just love it. I love how it smells, and I love to push it around, and it's greasy and gooey, and it's just a lot of fun to use. But all of it is alchemy. We're all magicians.
I just wanted to say to Robert, I know, Robert, with your wonderful materials, your wonderful paints, that you have helped other artists create their own work and change their direction and move them one way or another, because they come to you and say, what can I do with this? And you always have an answer.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I've always felt that we are the partner to art education, that so much of art education now is about sort of theory and your approach and being original, that we try to help painters make successful paintings, you know, from a technical standpoint. And, you know, how do you construct it? How do you make it dry faster? How do you make it dry slower? How do you know, what's the best way to paint it, you know, very transparently, or how to make that painting zing in the most intense way. So yes, we're a very small company of, you know, 25 to 27 people, and we have 2.5 full-time people who do nothing but help artists outside of the factory with their questions. I mean, it just streams in hundreds and hundreds of emails and telephone calls, and we're there to just help painters to be successful with their work. So thank you for asking.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, the galleries are still open tonight because we're open late Wednesdays, so you can maybe spend some time chatting with some of the other artists if you'd like. And I just want to thank you so much for putting yourself out there to take some questions. I think that added a lot to the sort of my presentation and that discussion. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight.